The coral sand beneath my face felt like broken glass, each grain cutting into my cheek as I pressed myself deeper into what passed for cover. Above me, a Japanese Nambu machine gun chattered its deadly song, the bullets snapping overhead like angry hornets. Blood from a gash on my forehead dripped onto my rifle stock, mixing with the coral dust that seemed to coat everything in this godforsaken place. 3 feet to my left, Corporal Bill Leiden's body lay twisted and still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the October sky. We'd been on Peleliu for 3 weeks, and I was beginning to wonder if any of us would ever leave. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, when Westill had hoped that this would be another quick Pacific victory. The morning of September 15, 1944, dawned clear and hot aboard the transport ship George Clymer. I stood at the rail with the other men of K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, watching the island of Peleliu grow larger on the horizon. At 19 years old, I'd already seen combat at Guadalcanal, but nothing had prepared me for what we were sailing toward. 3 days. That's what the brass had told us. Maybe 4 at the outside. Major General William Rupertus himself had promised that the 1st Marine Division would secure this 6-mile-long chunk of coral in no time. Admiral Chester Nimitz needed Peleliu's airfield to support the upcoming invasion of the Philippines. It looked simple enough on the maps, just another dot in the Pacific to be painted American blue. Captain Andy Haldani, our company commander, had gathered us around the previous evening for the final briefing. Haldani was one of those officers who'd earned our respect the hard way by keeping us alive and never asking us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. His usually steady voice carried an edge of concern as he pointed to the aerial photographs spread across the makeshift table. "The Navy's been pounding them for 3 days straight," he said, stubbing out his cigarette. "Battleships, cruisers, carrier planes, the whole works. Intelligence estimates maybe 1,000 Japs left on the whole island." He paused, studying our faces in the dim light. "But remember what I've always told you boys, the only good intelligence is what you see with your own eyes." How right he was. The island looked peaceful enough as we approached. Peleliu was shaped like a lobster claw, with dense jungle in the north and what appeared to be relatively open terrain in the south where we'd be landing. The beaches were designated by color Orange 1 and Orange 2 for the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 5th Marines, Orange 3 for the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines. Our target was Orangetwo, right in the center of the assault. At 0530 hours, the final naval bombardment began. The battleship Pennsylvania and heavy cruiser Indianapolis opened up with their main batteries, their shells screaming overhead like express trains. For 30 minutes, the island disappeared behind walls of smoke and flame. Surely nothing could survive that inferno. The first hint that something was wrong came when we loaded into the LVTs, the tracked landing vehicles we called Amtraks. Gunnery Sergeant Elmo Haney, a veteran of the old Corps who'd served in China before the war, spat a stream of tobacco juice over the side and shook his grizzled head. "Too quiet," he muttered. "Way too quiet." I clutched my M1 Garand tighter and tried to control the familiar pre-battle butterflies dancing in my stomach. Around me, the other men of K Company made their final preparations. Corporal R.V. Bergen checked his bar for the 100th time. Private J. Dillot, our Cajun from Louisiana, his rosary beads and whispered prayers in French. These were good men, Marines I'd fought alongside before, and I drew comfort from their presence. At 0832 hours, the first wave hit the beach. The coral reef that fringed Peleliu's coast should have been our first warning. Our LVT lurched and ground against the razor-sharp formations, the driver cursing as he tried to find deeper water. Frothed front hatch, I could see Orange Beach, two approaching, a narrow strip of white sand backed by dense scrub and what looked like solid jungle. "Lock and load," Captain Haldani shouted over the engine noise. "Remember, get off this beach fast." The longer we stay, the more Japs can zero in on us. The Amtrak's tracks finally found purchase on the coral sand, and we lurched forward into the surf. That's when the world exploded. The Japanese had held their fire during the naval bombardment, waiting in their carefully prepared positions for this moment. Now they opened up with everything they had. Artillery shells from hidden guns in the ridgeline began falling among the landing craft. Machine gun fire from concealed pillboxes swept the beach. Mortar rounds dropped with deadly precision into the crowded ranks of Marines struggling to get inland. Our LVT shuddered to a halt 50 yards from the water's edge, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. "Everybody out," the coxswain screamed. "She's done for." We tumbled over the sides into knee-deep water, immediately coming under fire from at least 3 different directions. Private Johnny Marmot, who'd been joking about Peleliu girls just minutes before, pitched forward into the surf with a sniper's bullet through his skull. The water around him turned red. "Move! Move! Get to the seawall." Sergeant Mac McHenry was up and running, his Thompson submachine gun chattering as he returned fire at muzzle flashes in the tree line. We followed, stumbling through the coral sand that seemed to grab at our boots with every step. The seawall turned out to be a low ridge of coral about 4 feet high, barely enough to provide cover from the murderous crossfire. I dove behind it just as a burst of machine gun fire chewed up the sand where I'd been standing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the bolt on my rifle. All along Orange Beach, the story was the same. The 1st Marines on our right were pinned down under withering fire from a massive concrete blockhouse the Navy's bombardment had barely scratched. The 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marines was taking casualties from hidden positions that seemed to sprout from the very coral itself. Captain Haldani slid into the depression beside me, his map already torn and blood-stained. "Sledgehammer," he called, using the nickname the squad had given me. "Take your fire team and see if you can spot where that machine gun is firing from." I nodded, too scared to trust my voice, and motioned to the 3 men nearest me, Corporal Bergen, Private D. Lowe, and a replacement named Phillips, who joined us just before we shipped out. We low-crawled along the coral ridge, trying to locate the source of the fire that was keeping our entire company pinned down. It took 20 minutes of careful observation before Bergen spotted it, a camouflage position built into what looked like a natural coral formation about 100 yards inland. The Japanese had spent months preparing these defenses, turning Peleliu into a fortress that made our previous island assaults look like training exercises. Son of a Bergen whispered. No wonder Thenavy bombardment didn't do squat. You can't see these positions until you're right on top of them. The machine gun was a Type 96, what we called a Nambu, manned by at least 3 Japanese soldiers. Every time one of our Marines tried to move forward, that gun would open up, forcing everyone back to the seawall. It was a masterpiece of defensive positioning. Captain Haldani made the decision to call in naval gunfire support, but the Pennsylvania was already engaged supporting the 1st Marines. We were on our own. "We're going to have to take it out the hard way," Haldani announced. "Sledge, Bergen, I want you to work around to the left. See if you can get close enough to put a grenade in that position. The rest of us will keep their heads down with covering fire." What followed was 6 hours of the most vicious, close-quarters fighting I'd experienced in 2 years of war. The Japanese weren't the same enemy we'd faced at Guadalcanal. These weren't half-starved troops hanging on desperately to a jungle airstrip. These were well-fed, well-armed veterans who'd had months to prepare their positions and were determined to make us pay for every yard of coral. Bergen and I spent an hour crawling through the scrub brush, using every fold in the terrain to work our way toward the machine gun nest. The coral tore at our uniforms and expositskin, leaving bloody scratches that burned with salt and sweat. Phillips, the replacement, was hit in the shoulder by a sniper before we'd covered 50 yards. He lay there whimpering until a Navy corpsman managed to reach him under covering fire. When we finally got within grenade range, we discovered why the position had been so hard to spot. The Japanese had built it inside a natural coral cave, with multiple firing ports and what appeared to be an escape tunnel leading deeper into the ridge. Bergen's first grenade bounced harmlessly off the coral overhead. The second one made it inside, but the explosion seemed to have little effect. We could still hear voices inside, speaking in rapid Japanese. "We need a flamethrower," Bergen said, wiping sweat and coral dust from his eyes. "Or a satchel charge. Something bigger than hand grenades." But our flamethrower team was pinned down 200 yards away, and our demolitions expert had been killed in the first minutes of the landing. We were going to have to do this with rifle and bayonet. The assault on that single machine gun position took the combined efforts of 12 Marines and cost us 4 casualties, including Corporal Phillips, who died of his wounds before the corpsman could get him back to beach. When we finally silenced the gun, we found 3 dead Japanese soldiers inside the cave, along with enough ammunition to supply a full infantry company. They'd been prepared for a long fight. By 1500 hours, K Company had advanced perhaps 200 yards inland from Orange Beach. Our casualties were already approaching 30%, and we hadn't even reached the main Japanese defensive line yet. The promised 3-day operation was beginning to look like a sick joke. Captain Haldane called the surviving squad leaders together behind a shattered coral formation that provided some protection from sniper fire. His usually immaculate uniform was torn and stained with blood, some of it his own from a shrapnel wound on his left arm. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the constant gunfire, "we've got a problem. Intelligence was wrong about enemy strength, dead wrong. There's at least a full regiment of Japs on this island, maybe more, and they're dug in like ticks on a hound." He spread his tattered map on the ground, weighing down the corners with coral fragments. "We're here," he said, pointing to a spot that looked far too close to the beach for comfort. "Our objective for today was this ridge line here about a mile inland. At our current rate of advance, we'll be lucky to reach it by Christmas." Sergeant Mac McHenry, whose Thompson had been chattering all day, looked up from cleaning his weapon. "What's the word from regiment, Captain? Are we getting reinforcements?" Haldane's expression darkened. "The 1st Marines are worse off than we are. Colonel Chesty-Puller's boys ran into a meat grinder trying to take that blockhouse on the right flank. The 7th Marines are being held in reserve for now, but General Rupertus is under pressure from Nimitz to wrap this up quickly." The implications were clear. We were stuck on this hellish island until the job was done, regardless of cost. As if to emphasize the point, a Japanese artillery shell screamed over our position and exploded in the surf behind us, sending up a geyser of sand and seawater. The enemy had excellent observation of the entire beach area from positions we couldn't even see, let alone attack effectively. "All right, listen up," Haldane continued. "We dig in here for the night. Tomorrow we continue the attack toward the airfield. The Japs will probably try to counterattack after dark, so I want fighting holes dug deep and fields of fire cleared. No sleeping on watch. Anyone I catch napping gets to explain it to me personally. Digging a fighting hole in coral is like trying to excavate concrete with a teaspoon. The pickaxe hard surface chips away in tiny fragments, each swing of the entrenching tool sending shock waves up your arms. By the time full darkness fell at 1900 hours, most of us had managed to scrape out depressions barely deep enough to hide a prone man. I shared my hole with J.D. Lowe, the Cajun private who'd somehow managed to keep his sense of humor despite everything we'd been through that day. As we lay side by side in the coral gravel, listening to the sporadic crack of sniper fire and the distant rumble of Navy guns, he pulled out a battered photograph of a dark-haired girl. "Marie Boudreau," he whispered, showing me the picture by the light of a shielded flashlight. "Gonna marry her when I get back to Louisiana. Her papa's got a shrimp boat down in Lafourche Parish." "She's beautiful," I said, meaning it. In the photograph, the girl was smiling at the camera, her white dress bright against a background of Spanish moss and cypress trees. It was a glimpse of a world that seemed impossibly far from this coral nightmare. "What about you, Sledgehammer? You got a girl back home?" I thought about the letters in my pack from a girl named Helen, a nursing student I'd met during leave in Mobile. "Maybe," I said, "if I can figure out what to say in my letters. Hard to write about this stuff, you know." Jay nodded understanding. My last letter to Marie, I told her we were on a beautiful tropical island with palm trees and white sand beaches. Didn't seem right to tell her about the coral and the blood and the smell. The smell. That was something that never made it into the newspaper accounts or the patriotic speeches back home. Peleliu smelled like death, not just the obvious odors of cordite and blood, but something deeper and more pervasive. The coral itself seemed to reek of decay, as if the island had been soaked in death for so long that it had become part of its very substance. At 0200 hours, the Japanese came. They didn't announce their attack with bonsai charges or shouted slogans. These were professionals who moved through the darkness like ghosts, probing for weak spots in our perimeter. The first sign of trouble was a grenade explosion about 50 yards to our left, followed by the distinctive chatter of a Japanese Nambu machine gun. "Here they come," someone shouted in the darkness. Muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers all along our defensive line. I pressed my cheek against the stock of my M1 and tried to pick out targets in the confusion of shadows and gunfire. A figure moved against the stars, definitely not one of ours based on the silhouette of his helmet. I squeezed the trigger and saw him spin and fall. Whether I'd hit him or he'd simply taken cover, I couldn't tell in the darkness. The attack lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. When dawn finally came, we found 7 Japanese bodies scattered around our perimeter, along with evidence that several wounded had been dragged away. We'd lost 2 Marines killed and 4 wounded, including Sergeant McHenry, who'd taken a bullet through the thigh. Captain Haldani made his way around the line as soon as it was light enough to move safely, checking on casualties and preparing for the day's advance. When he reached our position, I could see the exhaustion etched in every line of his face. Like the rest of us, he'd gotten maybe 2 hours of broken sleep. "How you boys holding up?" he asked, settling into our hole to study his map. "We'll make it, Captain," Jay replied, though his usual grin was notably absent. "Long as you don't ask us to dig any more holes in this coral." Haldani actually managed a tired smile at that. "I'm afraid that's exactly what we're going to be doing, son. Intelligence finally figured out what we're up against." He pointed to a series of ridgelines marked on his map with red ink, marks that hadn't been there the day before. "The Japs have turned the whole northern part of the island into a fortress. Caves, tunnels, interlocking fields of fire, the works. They call it the impregnable pocket, and it's going to be a son of a to crack." Over the next 2 weeks, K Company clawed its way forward yard by bloody yard toward the complex of coral ridges that dominated central Peleliu. Each position we took revealed 3 more, each more heavily defended than the last. The Japanese had learned from their defeats earlier in the war and adapted their tactics accordingly. Gone were the wasteful bonsai charges and exposed positions. These defenders fought from prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire, falling back only when their positions became untenable, and even then extracting a heavy price for each cave and pillbox we captured. The heat was our constant enemy, almost as deadly as enemy fire. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, turning our steel helmets into furnaces and making every piece of equipment too hot to touch with bare skin. Water was rationed to 2 canteens per man per day, barely enough to sustain life in that hellish environment, let alone support the physical demands of combat. On September 18th, 3 days after the landing, we lost Captain Haldani. We were assaulting what the map designated as Hill 140, though the Marines had already nicknamed it Bloody Nose Ridge for obvious reasons. The Japanese had honeycombed the coral formation with caves and firing positions, each one carefully sited to provide supporting fire for the others. Taking it required small unit actions, squads and fire teams working their way up the razor-sharp coral slopes while under constant observation from enemy positions. Haldani was forward with the assault teams, as usual. He never asked his men to go anywhere he wouldn't go himself, a quality that had earned him the devotion of every Marine K company. I was maybe 50 yards behind him, providing covering fire with my M1, when a Japanese sniper put a bullet through his chest. I saw him stagger and fall, his hand reaching out as if trying to grab onto something solid. For a moment, he tried to get back up, his lips moving as if he were giving orders, but the blood spreading across his dungaree jacket told the real story. By the time our corpsman reached him, Captain Andrew Haldani was dead. The loss of Haldani was like losing a father. He'd been the heart of K Company, the man we all looked to when things got tough. His replacement was a good Marine, but he wasn't Andy Haldani, and we all felt the difference. J.D. Lowe took it particularly hard. He'd been one of Haldani's favorites, and the captain's death seemed to drain something vital out of the cheerful Cajun. He still fought with the same courage and determination, but the easy smile and constant stream of stories about Louisiana disappeared. Like the rest of us, he was becoming something harder and more brittle with each day on Peleliu. The assault on Bloody Nose Ridge continued for 6 more days. We'd attack a position, take casualties, fall back, reorganize, and attack again. The coral was so hard that even a direct hit from a 75mm artillery shell barely chipped the surface, leaving the Japanese defenders largely unaffected by our preliminary bombardments. It was during this period that I first encountered the flamethrowers that would become synonymous with Pacific Island warfare. Private Ronnie Toole, a kid from Ohio who couldn't have been more than 18, carried one of the portable flame units that were proving to be our most effective weapon against the cave positions. "It's the only thing that works against these holes," he explained during a brief lull in the fighting. "Bullets just bounce off the coral, and grenades don't have enough punch to do the job. But fire gets into every crack and crevice." I watched him in action during an assault on a particularly stubborn machine gun position. Toole crawled to within 20 yards of the cave mouth, ignoring the bullets cracking overhead, and sent a long tongue of flame deep into the position. The screams that came from inside the cave were unlike anything I'd heard before, and I hoped I'd never hear them again. But it worked. The machine gun fell silent, and we were able to advance another 50 yards up the ridge. The cost was enormous. By September 25th, K Company had been reduced to less than half its original strength. The 1st Marines had been so badly mauled that they were pulled out of the line and replaced by the 321st Infantry Regiment from the 81st Infantry Division, soldiers rather than Marines, but welcome reinforcements nonetheless. The worst part of fighting on Peleliu wasn't the heat or the constant danger, or even watching your friends die. It was the caves. The Japanese had spent months, maybe years, preparing their defensive positions. Natural caves in the coral had been enlarged and connected by tunnels, creating an underground fortress that extended deep into the bowels of the island. Some caves were large enough to hold a full platoon of defenders, complete with stockpiles of ammunition, food, and water that could sustain a garrison for weeks. Clearing these positions required a special kind of courage that I'm not sure I possessed. You'd approach the mouth of a cave knowing that somewhere in the darkness ahead, enemy soldiers were waiting with rifles, machine guns, and grenades. The only way to neutralize the position was to go in after them, and caves don't offer much room for maneuver or retreat. On October 1st, 16 days after the landing, my squad was tasked with clearing a cave complex on what we'd started calling Death Valley, a narrow gorge between 2 coral ridges that had already cost us dozens of casualties. Intelligence believed the caves were being used as a command post, which meant they had to be taken regardless of cost. Corporal Bergen had been promoted to squad leader after our previous corporal was evacuated with wounds, and he gathered us around a coral outcropping to explain the plan. There were only 6 of us left from the original squad. The rest were replacements who'd arrived over the past 2 weeks to fill our depleted ranks. Simple job, Bergen said. Thof's expression suggested otherwise. We go in, kill any Japs we find, and secure the position. Tool will lead with the flamethrower. I'll be right behind him with the Thompson, and the rest of you follow at 5-yard intervals. He paused, looking at each of us in turn. If anyone gets hit in there, don't stop to help unless I give the word. The corpsmen can handle casualties once we've cleared the cave. Our job is to keep moving forward until there's nothing left to kill. The cave entrance was maybe 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, just large enough for a man to enter in a crouch. Tool went in first, the pilot light on his flamethrower casting weird shadows on the coral walls. The rest of us followed, our rifles held ready, every nerve straining to detect movement or sound in the darkness ahead. 20 feet into the cave, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. That's where they were waiting for us. The first burst of machine gun fire came from a position on the left side of the chamber, the muzzle flashes strobing like lightning in the confined space. Tool went down immediately, his flamethrower clattering across the coral floor. Bergen opened up with his Thompson, the submachine gun's rapid fire deafening in the enclosed space. I rolled right, trying to find cover behind a coral formation, and came face to face with a Japanese soldier who'd been hidden in a side tunnel. For a frozen moment, we stared at each other across a distance of maybe 3 feet. 2 young men, both far from home, both trying to kill the other before he could be killed himself. I was faster. My bayonet took him in the chest, sliding between his ribs with surprising ease. He looked surprised more than anything else, his mouth opening as if to speak, but only blood came out. He died still looking at me, his eyes reflecting the muzzle flashes from the continuing firefight. The battle for that single cave lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, we found 4 Japanese soldiers dead and evidence that several others had escaped through connecting tunnels deeper in the ridge. Tool was wounded but alive, though his flamethrower was damaged beyond field repair. We'd gained maybe 50 yards of coral and eliminated 1 machine gun position. The cost: 2 Marines wounded, 1 flamethrower destroyed, and most of our ammunition expended. At that rate, we'd be on Peleliu until the war ended. As October wore on, the nature of the fighting on Peleliu began to change. The Japanese no longer attempted to defend the entire island. They couldn't, given their losses and our gradual expansion of the perimeter. Instead, they concentrated their remaining forces in the most defensible positions in the northern ridges, turning each cave and pillbox into an individual fortress that had to be reduced by direct assault. This was warfare at its most primitive and personal. Battles were fought at ranges of 10 or 15 yards, sometimes less. You looked into the faces of the men you killed, saw the fear in their eyes that mirrored your own. There was nothing glorious or heroic about it, just young men dying in coral caves thousands of miles from home. J.D. Lowe was killed on October 3rd. We were assaulting another cave complex, following the same brutal routine that had become standard for K Company. Jay was carrying extra ammunition for our barman when a Japanese grenade landed among our advancing fire team. He had maybe 2 seconds to react, enough time to throw himself on the grenade or dive for cover. He chose to throw himself on the grenade. The explosion was muffled by his body, saving the lives of at least 3 other Marines, including myself. When the smoke cleared, there wasn't enough left of J.D. Lowe to send home to Louisiana. I found the photograph of Marie Boudreau scattered in pieces across the coral, her smiling facetorn and blood-stained but still recognizable. That night, I wrote my first honest letter home since landing on Peleliu. I told Helen about the coral that cut like glass, about the smell of death that permeated everything, about watching friends die in places whose names weren't even on most maps. I told her about Jay and Captain Haldani and all the others whose graves were marked only by rifles stuck bayonet first into the coral, their helmets hanging on the rifle butts. I never sent the letter. Some truths are too heavy for those back home to carry. By mid-October, it had become clear that the 1 St. Marine Division was fought out. We'd been in continuous combat for a month, suffering casualties that would have destroyed most military units. K Company was down to perhaps 30 men from its original strength of over 200. The 1st and 3rd Battalions were in similar condition. General Rupertus finally admitted what every Marine on the island had known for weeks. This wasn't going to be a quick operation. The 81st Infantry Division was brought in to relieve the Marines, taking over the grinding job of reducing the remaining Japanese positions one cave at a time. We were evacuated to the Russell Islands on October 20th, 35 days after landing on Peleliu. Of the men who'd made the assault on Orange Beach back in September, fewer than half walked aboard the transport ships that would take us away from that coral hell. The rest were buried in the military cemetery that had grown like a cancer behind the beach, their graves marked by simple wooden crosses bearing names and serial numbers. I stood at the ship's rail as Peleliu disappeared behind us, trying to make sense of what we'd accomplished. The island was officially secure, though Japanese soldiers would continue to emerge from caves and tunnels for months to come. We'd captured the airfield that Admiral Nimitz needed for his Philippine operations, though at a cost that made even hardened commanders wince. The final butcher's bill was staggering: 1,794 Americans killed and 8,010 wounded out of the 28,000 men who'd participated in the operation. The Japanese garrison of approximately 11,000 men had been virtually annihilated. Only 202 prisoners were taken, most of them Korean laborers who'd been forced to work on the island's defenses. 67 years have passed since I left Peleliu, and not a day goes by that I don't think about that coral island and the men who died there. The nightmares have faded with time, and the physical wounds have healed, but memories remain as sharp and painful as the coral that tore at our flesh during those terrible weeks in 1944. People often ask me if it was worth it, if the strategic value of Peleliu justified the horrific cost in American lives. It's a question I've struggled with for decades, and I'm no closer to an answer now than I was as a 19-year-old Marine crawling through coral caves with death waiting around every corner. What I do know is this: the men who died on Peleliu were not numbers in a casualty report or pawns in some grand strategic game. They were individuals: J.D. Lowe with his dreams of shrimp boats and Spanish moss, Captain Haldani with his quiet competence and unshakable integrity, Ronnie Toole with his flamethrower and his determination to see Ohio again. They were someone's son, brother, husband, or father, and their loss left wounds in countless hearts that time has never fully healed. The official histories will tell you that Peleliu was a necessary stepping stone toward victory in the Pacific, that its capture contributed to the eventual defeat of Japan and the end of World War II. They'll cite statistics about enemy forces destroyed and strategic objectives secured. They'll note that the lessons learned about cave warfare on Peleliu proved invaluable during the subsequent battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. All of that may be true, but it misses the human dimension of what happened on that island. War, at its core, is not about grand strategies or geopolitical objectives. It's about individuals making impossible choices under unimaginable circumstances, about ordinary people finding reserves of courage they never knew they possessed, about the bonds of loyalty and friendship that can survive even the hell of combat. I learned things on Peleliu that no young man should have to learn: about the fragility of life, about the thin line that separates civilization from savagery, about the terrible weight of survival when so many others don't. I learned that heroism is not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. That leadership is measured not by rank or authority, but by the willingness to share danger with those under your command. Most importantly, I learned about the debt that the living owe to the dead. Every day since leaving Peleliu has been borrowed time, a gift purchased with the lives of better men than myself. That knowledge is both a burden and a responsibility. A burden because the survival carries its own weight of guilt and sorrow. A responsibility because those who died deserve to be remembered not as abstractions, but as the individuals they were. The island of Peleliu today is a peaceful place, covered with tropical vegetation that has grown over the coral ridges where we fought and died. Tourists visit the beaches where we landed, taking photographs and collecting souvenirs, most of them unaware of what happened there nearly 7 decades ago. The caves where we fought such desperate battles have been sealed or have collapsed with time, their secrets buried beneath decades of accumulated coral dust and decay. But for those of us who were there, Peleliu remains frozen in time, a place of perpetual September heat and coral dust, where young men learned the true cost of war and discovered reserves of courage they never knew they possessed. We carry that island within us, a constant reminder of what we lost and what we gained during those terrible weeks when the outcome of the war hung in the balance and every yard of ground was purchased with American blood. The generation that fought World War II is passing away, taking with it their first-hand memories of places like Peleliu, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and countless other battlefields scattered across the Pacific. Soon, all that will remain are the written records and the monuments, cold stone and bronze, that can never capture the full reality of what happened in those coral caves and jungle clearings. That's why these memories matter, why the stories must be told and retold even when they're difficult to hear. Not to glorify war or promote any particular political agenda, but to honor the memory of those who paid the ultimate price and to remind future generations that freedom has always come at a cost. The men who died on Peleliu gave their lives not for abstract concepts of democracy or liberty, but for each other, for the Marine fighting beside them, for the folks back home they'd never see again, for the future they believed in even when they couldn't see it clearly through the smoke and chaos of battle. As I write these words in the comfort of my home, surrounded by the family and grandchildren that J.D. Lowe will never have, I'm struck by the profound inequity of survival. Why did I make it off the island when so many better men didn't? What accident of fate or divine providence determined that I would live to see victory while they would remain forever young, forever trapped in thick coral hell where we left them? I don't have answers to those questions, and I've stopped looking for them. What I have instead is a commitment to memory, to keeping alive the stories of the men who didn't come home, to ensuring that their sacrifice continues to mean something long after the last veteran has joined them in whatever comes after this life. The Pacific War officially ended on September 2, 1945, when Japanese officials signed the surrender documents aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But for those of us who fought on places like Peleliu, the war never really ended. We carry it with us always, a part of our DNA that shapes every day and every